Okay. I want to discuss just socialism in general. A lot of people, there's a lot of debate on what form of socialism or what system of society that us leftists are going to put up post capitalism. And there seems to be a lot of, I guess, ignorant, just general ignorant knowledge of what we need to put in place, and we've instead of dissecting and analyzing the current class struggles in this nation, America, analyzing that, and from that, deciding what our next step is, what the next step in, what we're going to put in place. I think a lot of people on the left, especially the revolutionary left, are choosing specific forms and specific governments or movements, and they just like what they do and what they stand for, and de facto think that here in America that's what we should do. That's a very, very intellectually weak and a very unstable and very dangerous thing to. By the way, ignore the TV right here. It's a very dangerous thing to adopt and go forth. And so I wanted to take some time to talk about, different countries and why the system of governments are what they are. Because I think it's a very good, or I think it would be a very good lesson for us to just kind of, talk about this, and so that we can kind of go to that next stage and just kind of stop bickering between one another. I mean, there are always going to be fights. There's always going to be debates. There's always going to be arguments. There's always going to be fighting if we're going to put up a new form of society, a different economy. Absolutely. I just think if I just add some context and history, I think that it'll kind of help, I guess, ease some questions, especially people that are newer to the to I guess the revolutionary left. People that are like liberals or like somewhat conservatives, but they didn't know what it was. So I just want to take some time into debate on, and it really stems onto two vastly different sides of the world and different struggles that each society has had to go through, and why their society is what they are today. There's like Eastern and I would say Western forms of socialism. Different cultures, and obviously every nation is its own. But there's two very common trends. At least I, as an American who isn't ignorant of history and isn't ignorant of, pre and post revolution. For a lot of the countries on the Eastern Hemisphere, large parts of Asia, Russia, some of the Slavic regions, Southeast Asia, their history and their forms of socialism has been, without question, a lot more, I would say, authoritarian. That's just is what it is. I'm not going to debate on that's the direction we should go or shouldn't go. That's just kind of simply what most Eastern forms of socialism, or any flavor of Marx's ideas, have manifested itself. So let's start with the Soviet Union. With Russia, or in the Slavic region, pre-revolution, it was just a monarchy. It was an aristocratic, bureaucratic basket case. It was so backwards, so underdeveloped, very illiterate. That whole region was destroyed in World War I. They lost that war. People, the peasantry and the handful, quite literally handful of industrial workers, they didn't even want. They never even saw democracy as something that they needed. they had no exposure to democracy. When they thought of democracy, they thought it was more French or German than it was Russian. You know, and obviously didn't help that the Tsar was very, I would say, close to the French aristocrats not that long before the war. And so when Lenin, came up and did a more democratic, centralized organization of his revolution, people did not bat an eye. He drew a lot of unionists and a lot of even syndicalists and orthodox Marxists into the loop of the Bolsheviks and led the revolution. It needed a very strong revolutionary vanguard in order to industrialize and modernize Russia. It needed that. It had no real organization. There are so many ethnic and religious minorities and peoples in that huge section of land in the world. There are so many. And so the way that the people kind of accepted it and kind of wanted it was the big strong state. It organized and it planned out very thoroughly agriculture, industry, education, and healthcare. It was one of the struggles that it filled, the struggle of not have any sort of infrastructure to go from point A to point B. Nowhere in Russia was that on any capacity that was suitable for the needs of the future. The land, they had mass amounts of farmland, but it was almost unusable because there was no planning or organization on how to use the farmland, what to plant, when to plant, who was going to harvest, who was going to plant. You go down the list. So the need, the struggles in pre-Soviet Union required that form of government. In China, pre-Mao Revolution, you got to think, the Japanese butchered Manchuria. They went to war, and not even at war. They've been colonized by France, by the UK, even America to some extent. There's also centuries-long war of literally warlords just fighting over just land. They were in a constant state of civil war for centuries. Mass peasantry had no power of their own land. Landlords were literally dictating where were they even going to live, what materials are they going to use. There's no form of proletarian power. Vietnam, Laos, France, they try to colonize Vietnam. It was 1955 when the Vietnamese finally rebelled against France and started, damn near 2-decade-long Vietnam Civil War. Same thing with Laos. French Indochina was a very large section of Southeast Asia. There were indigenous peoples there that were fighting for their own economic sovereignty. It was being threatened constantly. There was, throughout all these nations, there was that rise of left-wing nationalism. I think we're fairly familiar with right-wing nationalism. We've seen so many kinds in so many different nations. Left-wing nationalism has been, I guess, a very strong proponent and one of, but not the only, form that socialism will manifest itself. Basically, protectionism, protecting borders, things like that, but internally, domestically, it's a very liberating, they don't put down minorities, and, they try to not have strong police states, although that's been, let's just say, ignored. So that's just what some of the countries and why more authoritative, more centralized governments and economies have been risen up. Because the people have been largely disorganized. They're not industrialized. no sense of agricultural planning, couldn't even feed anyone properly. There's, slight struggles post-revolution for, let's say, a few years in each one of those countries, but they're also recreated a new nation, so, I'm not exactly holding that against them. In the West, and when I'm saying the West, I don't mean America and UK. When I mean the West, it's, America, Canada, a lot of Latin nations, South America, Cuba, thrown in there, definitely the UK, parts of Western Europe. Even a lot of the class struggles in Central and Southern African, a lot of the Central and Southern African nations is very similar to early America and early UK. And I'll kind of go on about that. In America, post-Civil War, robber barons have been monopolized mass amounts of land and started to industrialize. Because America, compared to the Western world, was industrializing, and we were, organizing agriculture to a way that was sustainable for our population. We could feed most of the people some of the time without completely collapsing. Obviously, we had struggles. We can go to the high hills, but in comparison to the rest of the world, America was fairly modern at the late 19th, early 20th century. But as with most capitalist nations, and it was even worse in America, oftentimes children were with labor slaves. They absolutely had no say. Women were not even ostracized. They were quite literally, it was open season. They were not able to even step foot in the workplace oftentimes. They were seen as mere factories for more proletariat in Marx's language. The current workers that were in the factories, that were in the farmland, in the new modern stores that were kind of opening up, wages were disgusting. They were nothing. A quarter a week. Workers had to pay for their own tools that they used for their work. Eugene Debs, one of my favorite, not mentors, but one of the people I aspire to at least, kind of incorporate a lot of my ideals with. He himself had to use his own wages to buy a paint scraper that he used until he died. He used to basically scrape paint off rail cars when he was 13. When he was 15, he was a fireman throwing coal into a boiler. So the class struggles in this country and in the UK was very similar. There was no need for a central or an authoritative state, but there was a strong need of organized labor, militant unionization. You saw teachers and machinists working together. It had a deeper need of class solidarity rather than sovereignty, if that makes any sense. In Western Europe, very similar. They went from monarchies to aristocrats to Nazi Germany, ripping right through their nation, burning down their homes and shutting down all forms of dissent and organized labor. The Nazi Party, they made strikes illegal, absolutely. Unions were the biggest protector of civilians. Unions fought for the right to bear arms oftentimes, to take up arms against the Nazis. So that's another need of less authoritative governments, because their exposure to centralized authoritative governments were from Nazis to aristocrats. A lot of Latin nations. Not only were they completely colonized by fruit companies and mining companies, but their exposure to big government. I hate using that word, but I'm just using it as a placeholder. Their exposure to big government were literally fascist dictatorships that were propped up by foreign nations. There are so many indigenous populations in Mexico, Guatemala, all the way down through South America. Bolivia, I think, is the last majority indigenous nation, to my knowledge. There's a huge union movement in South America right now. From Bolivia, Venezuela, unions have seats in government, which is almost never heard of anywhere in the world, which is the only main reason why people don't want Maduro to leave, despite Venezuela being in an economic depression right now, is because unions and direct people power have say in these governments, and they've never wanted nor have they needed a centralized power structure, or at least not to the level a lot of the Eastern societies have propagated. So also let's not even mention the corruption that a lot of these governments have had in early America, Latin America, UK, Western Europe. Minors in Africa, there's large union movements, and that are being directly oppositional, antagonistic towards their governments. So why am I bringing this up, and why am I separating government and labor unions? Because labor unions are not factions of the government, and I don't think they ever should be. I think they should be automatically democratic power structures that are directly to the people, that are not representatives or collect taxes of that sort. There should be power structures and organizing workers. That's really all unions have and probably will ever be. In China, for instance, independent labor unions are banned. There is no way for you as a factory worker to put up or be a part of or organize with a labor union that's independent from the government. The only forms of legal unions are administrations or organizations that are run by the Chinese government, or they're factions of the Chinese Communist Party. That's no form of people power. And I think people power is probably one of the purest forms of socialism. I think dictatorship of the proletariat should quite literally be masses should override minority power. Majority power over minority power. That might be misinterpreted, but I think you know what I mean. But and I'm saying this because here in America, we have one of the largest police states in the entire world. We have normal people, middle and lower classes, probably pay some of the highest taxes relative to what we get, if not by far, than the rest of the world. We have a huge military that, yes, will bomb the fuck out of an entire continent 8 times over, but we can't feed people. Wages are still stagnant. Healthcare is not able to be associated or organized in any moralistic way. We have a failure to respond to the COVID pandemic because our government have been separated from the people for decades. And that has been, the only way that's even been possible was the dissolvement of direct people power. There's been a war on unions for now about 40, 50 years. Before then, unions were overwhelmingly popular. Well, unions are popular right now, but you talk bad about a union in the 40s, in the 30s, even in the 50s, especially in the 50s, in the 60s. You talk bad about a union, ooh, you got shunned. Why are you against a union? painter down the street, he can afford his house because he's with a union. He's a good worker, shows up to work on time, works hard, and because of that, he earns really good wages with his union. They realize capitalist power is is antagonistic towards the people. Government power, it can be antagonistic on the people. The state does have a monopoly on violence, and I don't care what party is in power. The state will always have a monopoly on violence because the state dictates the laws and dictates what is legal and what isn't legal, what is just and what isn't just. So I think direct people power should take precedent over anything else. Now, I'm not if an underdeveloped nation tomorrow elected a Stalinist to centrally plan and reindustrialize its nation, I'm not going to poo-poo it, and I'm not going to judge the people that back that movement. I never will. Because there is a definite great utility in it. It responds quickly, and as long as the people actually have a say very well and accurately to the needs of the people. But, and I think it kind of shows just through this, when a nation is industrialized, when farmland is used and utilized in a semi-efficient way, capable way, with a skilled workforce that is literate, semi-fairly educated, sometimes more educated, sometimes less educated, don't really matter. When that happens, there's no need for an authoritative government, because now the people realize that they themselves have the power. They themselves can work towards a greater goal to make let's say this country better. Produce more food, produce more wealth, produce more goods, provide more services. Should we be more protectionist trade? Should we be more free trade? The people themselves, I think, should decide above all else what the next step should be. So I think that's kind of what I wanted to say. I just wanted to tell leftists, don't be ideological and don't be Puritan. I'm by far not perfect, but just analyze what the needs of your just even neighborhood or just your state is. I'm in Washington State. We're a fairly decently strong economy, decently large industrial sector, large farmland on the eastern side. We don't need a central planner. There's a strong union culture here in Washington, and it will forever stay that way. Unions have built Washington. So, I think our focus should be what should the needs be rather than what should be our ideological goal. And I think that's probably the biggest thing that leftists, especially American leftists, should consider. And I think we need to discuss these things in a much more concise and constructive, more substantive way, rather than a theoretical hypothesis. Yeah.